So this week, there's a pretty significant news. A fire, a big one, at Nottoway Plantation down in Louisiana. That was Thursday, May 15th.
That's right. And not wait, well, it wasn't just any old building. For anyone who doesn't know, it was actually the largest surviving antebellum mansion in the South.
Quite a landmark, yeah?
Absolutely. And, while the headlines scream building destroyed, this event really cracks open a much bigger conversation, doesn't it?
It really does.
It touches on, well, layers of U.S. history, how we remember things, how we interpret them. And these places, they mean very different things to different people. That's what we want to kind of explore with you today.
Exactly. So we've looked at the initial reports, BBC News, New York Post, just to get the facts straight about what actually happened.
Mm-hmm.
But we're also pulling from an article called The Future of Plantation Legacies. It gives some really crucial context about these kinds of sites and, well, the conflicting ways people see them.
Yeah, that broader picture is essential.
So for you listening, this deep dive is really about looking past the breaking news banner. It's about understanding the history, the memory, the emotions wrapped up in this fire, why it sparked such strong, diverse reactions.
Okay, so let's start with the fire itself. It happened Thursday afternoon. Location: White Castle, Louisiana. That's about half an hour south of Baton Rouge.
Yeah, that's right.
And reports say 2 employees spotted smoke up on the second floor. And the flames, they just spread incredibly quickly, tragically fast.
And the response, it sounds like it's pretty significant. Some reports said 30 to 40 firefighters. Others mentioned engines from like 10 different local departments.
A big response, yeah. But even with all that effort, the building was just so massive they couldn't save it.
Declared a total loss in the end.
A total loss, and massive is the word. We're talking 53,000 square feet.
Wow.
64 rooms, built originally back in 1859 by John Hampton Randolph.
And this is a crucial point, right? The labor.
Absolutely crucial. The construction, the running of the plantation afterwards, all of it depended entirely on the forced labor of enslaved people. Can't separate the building from that.
No.
Yeah.
And recently, it was being used as a resort, a wedding venue.
Right. Which, as we'll get into, adds this whole other layer of complexity to how people are reacting now.
So, the cause of the fire?
Still under investigation, officially. The New York Post did mention that fire officials initially suspected something electrical.
Okay, but TBC.
Yeah, still looking into it. But importantly, and thankfully, no reports of anyone getting hurt.
That's definitely good news.
It is. Okay, so let's shift to the historical significance here. Nottoway was a sugar plantation.
Right. Not cotton, sugar, which had its own specific brutalities.
Exactly. The whole operation, the wealth it generated, the social structure, it was all built on the backs of enslaved people through the brutal system of chattel slavery. The New York Post pointed out it cost about $80,000 to build in 1859.
Which is roughly, what, in today's money?
They estimated around $3 million. And that wealth, that opulence, came directly from exploiting people. Sugar plantations were notoriously harsh, incredibly labor-intensive. That shaped everything about life for the enslaved people there.
And it wasn't just left to crumble over time. There was a conscious effort to preserve Nottoway, wasn't there? It became this, architectural marvel, a tourist spot.
Mm-hmm. The article we mentioned, The Future of Plantation Legacies, talks about this, how these sites were often presented with what people call a whitewashed narrative. Meaning focusing on the pretty architecture, maybe a romanticized vision of the Old South, while downplaying or completely ignoring the horror and injustice of slavery that made it all possible.
Right, sort of preserving the shell, but not the full story.
Precisely. The preservation history often really prioritized the aesthetics, this kind of sentimental view of the past, over the fundamental cruelty involved, Nottoway becoming a museum in the 80s, then later this luxury wedding venue. It really highlights that.
Think about that contrast for a second. Celebrating a marriage, a union, in a place literally built by tearing families apart and denying basic humanity.
That juxtaposition is stark. And it's a huge part of why this fire has hit such different nerves.
And Nottoway isn't unique in this, is it? That article mentioned hundreds of these sites still exist.
Over 375 former plantation sites, mostly across the South. Louisiana, South Carolina, Georgia have a lot of them.
And many repurposed similarly. Museums, inns.
And wedding venues, yeah. That repurposing is really central to the differing reactions to the fire.
Okay, so let's talk about those reactions. On one side, you have people genuinely mourning the loss.
Right, absolutely. For some, it's the destruction of a significant piece of architecture, a historical landmark. People who value that kind of craftsmanship, the history embedded in the structure itself, they feel that loss keenly.
But then there's this completely different take.
A profoundly different one, yeah. And equally valid. For many people, especially Black Americans and descendants of those enslaved at places like Nottoway, the fire feels like, well, like symbolic justice.
The New York Post had that quote from Neo at the Black Wall Street Times.
Yeah, saying it felt like a small act of justice because the house was, quote, built by enslaved hands and later turned into a wedding venue that profited off our pain.
And that line, maybe now our ancestors can rest a little easier. Sometimes ashes feel like freedom. That's incredibly powerful.
It really is. It speaks volumes about the deep, ongoing pain these sites can represent, especially when their traumatic origins seem ignored or even celebrated in their modern use.
And then you have other official voices trying to bridge that gap, maybe.
Well, you have figures like the Iberville Parish President, Chris Daigle. He acknowledged Nottoway as a symbol of both, quote, grandeur and deep complexities, recognizing the history tied to injustice, but also pointing to its more recent role in reflection, education, and dialogue.
So acknowledging the tension there.
Exactly. It really throws that ongoing societal struggle with how to handle these places into sharp relief.
Okay, let's bring in the owner's perspective. William Daniel dies. He's relatively new to owning it, right?
Yeah, the reports say he's an attorney, describes himself as a preservationist. He acquired it fairly recently.
His reaction.
His stated intention is to rebuild. He emphasized wanting it to be a place for education, for reflecting on America's, complex history.
Okay, and what about his view on that history? Did he elaborate?
He did, according to the Post. He described himself and his wife as non-racist people, believing in equal opportunity. He acknowledged slavery was wrong, definitely.
Okay.
But he also said, we don't have any interest in left-wing radical stuff. We need to move forward on a positive note here, and we are not going to dwell on past racial injustice.
That's quite a statement.
It is. And it's worth noting he also owns the Steel Magnolia House, another historic property, though with a different kind of story attached. So you have this desire to preserve, but maybe a reluctance to fully grapple with the painful details of this particular past.
Which really tees up the bigger questions, doesn't it? About preservation itself. What are the main arguments for preserving sites like Nottoway?
Well, the article lays out a few common ones. Historical education is a big one. The idea that these places offer a tangible link to the past, a way to learn about slavery and its impact.
Okay, makes sense.
Then there's preserving memory, the fear that if you destroy these places, we might forget this part of history. And, there's also the practical side. Tourism dollars.
Yeah.
Many communities rely on that revenue.
Right. But the counter-arguments are powerful, too, especially around the ethics.
Absolutely. The argument that preserving them, especially in their grand state, can inadvertently seem to glorify a system of horrific oppression.
And the impact on descendants.
Exactly. For descendants of the enslaved, visiting these places can be incredibly painful, deeply distressing, especially seeing them used for celebrations, like weddings, that feel completely disconnected from or even disrespectful of that history.
So the historical value, it's not automatic just because it's old.
Not at all. The article argues pretty strongly that the real value comes from how these sites are interpreted. Are we honestly telling the full story? Are we centering the experiences, the labor, the suffering, the resistance of the enslaved people?
Or are we just focusing on the fancy columns and the mint juleps?
Right. If it's just about the architecture and a romanticized past, that educational value isn't just lost, it can actually be harmful. It requires honest interpretation centering enslaved voices.
And the impact of the fire on descendants.
Yeah.
So it sounds like that's complex, too, not a single reaction.
Definitely not. As we heard in that quote, for some, these grounds are places of immense pain, a spiritual weight. For others, though, they might be seen as sacred spaces, a place to remember ancestors, a tangible link, however fraught.
So the fire could be seen as justice by some.
Or as erasing evidence by others, erasing a place where they could connect with their family's past, even a painful one. The article really hammers home that the crucial thing is who controls the narrative. Who gets to tell the story of the site, whether it's standing or in ashes?
It really comes back to that, doesn't it? What is meaningful ethical preservation? Whose stories are we choosing to lift up?
Exactly. Those are the core questions.
So thinking about Nottoway's ashes, it makes you wonder, what is the real goal of preserving history? And whose story should be front and center? When a place built on so much suffering is destroyed, is it just destruction? Or can it, for some, feel like something else, maybe justice? And how do we find that balance between needing to educate people about the past, but also needing to be profoundly respectful of that past and its ongoing impact?
These are tough, critical questions, and the Nottoway fire really forces us to confront them. It's definitely more than just a news item about a building burning down.
Yeah, it's like a window into this ongoing, complicated conversation we're having in America about history, about memory, about justice.
A conversation that clearly needs to keep going.
Definitely something for you, the listener, to think about more. Maybe look into how other difficult historical sites are being handled, how their stories are being told. This deep dive really highlights that history isn't simple, and how we engage with it is always evolving.